and there's a couple of beats that's Jane and Bertha looking at each other with a level of recognition that I think is incredible.
There, Bertha is sort of acting as like a living metaphor for the truth. And before, maybe Jane was in sort of like this fantasy, or maybe not by her choice, of course, but kind of this illusion that she could be Miss Rochester. And now that she knows that Bertha exists, the real Miss Rochester hands her back the uniform of the role that she must take on again. Hello, Lillian. Are you feeling theatrical today?
I'm feeling so theatrical. I'm just feeling like, I feel like I'm on stage, you know?
Ooh, yeah, me too, actually. I also, everything feels just a little different because, you're actually here in my house, which, wow, it's like I have a famous person in my midst.
Yeah, that's how most people feel when I go to their houses, even if they don't know about my podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
I currently am feeling very much like I'm your fiance, Sam, because I'm in his office. Because we're not in the same room because we didn't want to cross-contaminate our audio.
Gross.
That's the only way to describe it.
So Lillian is here up in the cities. We are recording in roughly the same place today, so this will be a fun time. But we are delighted to come to you with this week's episode talking about technically our most modern adaptation that we've seen. 2020, right? Is when this play premiered?
It was released in 2020. It was filmed in 2015.
But that's
close.
Okay, wait, what would have come before that? Because 2011 was the most recent movie.
When the autobiography of Jane Eyre ended, that might have been into 2015. It was 2013 that they started it.
Okay.
So it is at least tied for most recent.
Well, that is exciting. But either way, this is our first stage play production of Jane Eyre, in which it was not technically a musical, though I have to say I did really enjoy all of the songs.
Oh my God. The songs were so incredible. So we went to lunch before this and it was so hard to not talk about. Because we save our hot, fresh takes for you, our lovely listeners. But Piper, what did you think of this play?
I really loved this play, and I think I can confidently say that though the character portrayals and performances weren't necessarily my favorite, the creativity and vision behind this production easily like top 2 for me of all the ones we've watched.
I'm debating this being my favorite.
Cool.
Like this, it is so good. It's so good, you guys. Like, I can't stop talking about it. And I think one of the things that I really loved about it, we talk a lot on this show about how a lot of the adaptions are in conversation with each other. Mm-hmm. And I think what I really loved about this is it didn't feel influenced heavily by other ones. It felt really unique, and it really utilized the format of a play.
Yeah.
And is really different from anything else we've seen, but also feels incredibly true to the story of Jane Eyre.
Oh, yeah, totally. I think you saying, utilizing the format, right? This is one thing that I'm so excited about when we get into more kind of interesting adaptations. Because now, of course, we've seen what someone can do with a movie and a TV show many, many, many times. So it's really exciting, yes, to see what you can do with a different medium. And I might have mentioned this before, but there's a podcast that I really love called Musical Splaining, where the whole concept is that of the two hosts, one of them loves musicals and one of them hates musicals. And every week or so, they have to watch one and then talk about it. And something that they bring up a lot that I very much feel is there's something about a theater performance that is very different from a movie and TV show. And I think a big part of it is the fact that you are in this, it's more intimate. You are in an enclosed space with these performers, and you can't help but feel the emotion that they project. Because that's another big part of it, is that in theater, a lot of your acting is put to a larger scale because, you need the people in the back of the room to hear you, just as the people in the front of the room are getting your spit on their faces. So like there's this level that it kind of is brought up to, but there's this other level of intimacy that you feel. And even though we were watching a stage recording, that intensity comes through of how these people are projecting these emotions towards the
Yeah.
audience, and it's really cool.
We'll go into that, but some people are probably like, listen, I've literally never heard the story of Jane Eyre. I like don't I you guys seem really cool and fun, which we are. Thank you for knowing that about us. But could somebody please, in like as fast as possible, tell me
Mhm.
what on earth any of this is about?
Lillian, I can. There is a crying baby, and then there is a Jane, and she has an aunt and cousins who hate her, and she wishes that she was gone from this awful place. And then a nice lady is like, go to school. So she goes to school, and it's very intense. And she meets one nice person because everyone else is like mean and religious and cruel. And that one nice person says, turn your face to God, dies. And she's like, oh no. And so then she goes off to a fancy house where she's going to go be a governess. And there's a very loud child, and a very nice old lady, and a very grumpy man, and a dog that is also a human being. And then things happen, fires start, maybe sparks fly, and then a person is brought in to make Jane jealous. And then there's this big proposal, and it's screamy. And then a wedding happens, but it doesn't happen. And then she's like, oop, gotta go, bye. And then she's found by a religious dude and his nice sister. And then there's another fire, and she hears a voice, and she comes home, and there's a guy, and he's blind. And then they have a baby, and a baby cries, and it's a girl in the end.
Yay! Haven't done one that short in so long.
I know. I didn't want to like go over any of the stuff that I'm excited to talk about in detail, so I covered the basics.
It was perfect. It was 54 seconds. So under a minute. It's our first one in under a minute in a really long time.
I'm proud of
very
myself.
Exciting stuff. I'm proud of you.
Thank you. Lillian, I think one of the first things before we dive into like talking about all the little details that we loved about this, I think it's so crucial if you have not seen the production that we're talking about to try and attempt to visualize it. So can you please help us kind of create a mental picture? How would you describe sort of like the staging of this show? Because that was one of my favorite parts.
Yeah. So I really loved it. And that's one of the things I meant by like, they really utilize this format. I know that often plays will have like really elaborate sets. This had a very scaled down set, similar vibe to like the ones I think of. And I know that people are going to tell me that like, this is like this is a million places do this. I believe you. I'm not a theater person. I like it. I just don't like know all the things. Anyway, it feels very similar to like Hamilton. If you've ever seen Hamilton set, where it's like really, really scaled down and the sets are utilized to kind of get your imagination to picture different things. So it's a lot about the motion of the set. So we have like, it's a flat stage, and then with like really plain unvarnished wood goes essentially like up in a circle where you've got a ramp and then some steps that goes up around, and then ladders to this higher balcony area, which creates sort of this motion of people can just kind of keep going around and around, and it feels like you're going really high. Or people can be in two separate places, because if you're up on the balcony and somebody else is up on the front of the stage, you can assume those are two different places. So there's a lot of that in this. But a really like toned down set where a lot of the way that they establish space is through their movement, through the lighting, and then through some of the other sound and things like that.
Yeah, I also loved that. So, kind of the way that Lillian describes that the set kind of wraps around, sort of at the center is where the band is placed. So, there's these musicians who are mostly kept in shadow, and they are providing the background music. And every now and then, there's a character who comes out and kind of sings as we're either having like an emotional moment or as there's like a scene transition. But one thing that I also loved about the simplicity of this set is how much it requires the audience to kind of use their imagination and fill in the blanks. And it made me feel kind of like the excitement that I get when I was like a little kid, and even nowadays when I like see like a playground, I'm like, this jungle gym can be whatever I want it to be. It can be a castle or a spaceship or a swamp or a jungle or a mountain or a zoo or a house. And it's just like you get to fill in the blanks. And exactly like you said, the actors' movements kind of let us know what's happening and what the set has become. So I really loved that about it. That was really cool.
I also think it really draws you into paying attention to the actors and the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is an incredibly they did a really great job through the music and through that motion of creating a very rich world, but you're really focused on the people on stage.
Yes.
And I think that that's incredible, which brings me to one of my favorite things about this play that I have seen done before, but I don't know that I've ever seen it done quite to the extent that they did it in this, which is how many there's like 6 cast members and they play
Mm-hmm.
all the roles. Do you want to talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Sure. I think Jane is pretty much the only actor in the whole production that is just one character. Maybe Bertha's actor played someone else at some point, but pretty much she's just Bertha also. Which I think is also something could be said about that. The fact that those two women are the only people who don't change character. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, otherwise, I mean, the man who played Rochester, he started off as her brother, or no, sorry, her cousin, John Reed.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an interesting transition. And the man who played Brocklehurst, he was also the dog, which hilarious. Um,
So incredibly done pilot.
oh my
So good.
god. So good. The woman, I think one of my favorite actors of the entire cast was the woman who, God, she was so many characters. She started off as Bessie, and
Mm-hmm.
then she was Blanche, and then at times, she was also Diana.
Mm-hmm.
She was just so good.
She was incredible. And I think one of the other things is like, I don't know, at certain points you couldn't necessarily see them, but like most of the actors were on stage most of the time,
Yeah.
even if they were playing some of like parts that I would not have thought of as parts in this, but like
Hmm.
there, and I want to talk about lighting specifically, but like at moments they play lights, which gives the
Hmm.
lighting like this alive feeling the way that fire would be and like all of those things. And there's moments when they play the voices in her head, which I thought was an incredible narrative mechanism that I have not
Yes.
seen done, and certainly not done as well as they do it in this. It's so good.
That was one of my favorite parts too, when the ensemble essentially, yes, becomes her inner monologue, and it allows Jane to kind of have these moments of debate with herself, of kind of
Mm-hmm.
being like, should I do this? I don't know. And like the cast is kind of being Jane's voice of being like, here's
Mm-hmm.
good reasons why you should stay, or here's reasons why you should leave. And she's like, I have to make a decision. And so that was
Mm-hmm.
great. So creative.
Yeah, and it was a cool way. When she was alone on stage, at times she would speak back to those voices, but when
Hmm.
she wasn't, at times those voices were her thoughts.
Yeah.
And there were particular moments where that was really influential. But
I also
go
want to
ahead.
mention real quick before we get away from this topic is that I thought it was really cool that two of the female actors in the cast took on male characters in the story as well. So the
Mhm.
fact that the woman that we mentioned earlier, who was Bessie and Blanche, she was also the solicitor who interrupted the wedding, and then the actress who played both Helen and Adele also then played Sinjin. So
Mhm.
that was really cool. I would love this again. Here's something where I'm like, I want interviews with these cast members to be like, okay, what is it like being in a production and jumping between different characters' mindsets?
Mhm.
So that was neat, and I'm sure a fun challenge for those actors.
Yeah, and I did look into the actors. I could run through all of their names really quickly or the random TV episodes they've been in,
No
but
need.
they're all mostly known for being theater actors. Like they are
Cool.
British theater actors and they all have impressive resumes in that sense, but nothing that, unless if some of our listeners are like deep into the London theater scene, I guess like reach out to us and tell us all the cool things that you know. But otherwise, that's pretty much the most relevant stuff that I knew about. But I think I want to, because there's so much I want to talk about in this, I want to like talk about where this story starts earlier than any other adaptation of Jane Eyre that we've seen starts. It starts with
Mhm.
her literal birth.
Which I have to say, some of the creative things I wasn't super thrilled of. I did not like the adult woman doing the wah wah like baby cry. I was like, okay, we get that there's a baby. We don't need adult Jane making baby crying sounds. I also both performances of a child in this kind of bothered me. But it's just like, I don't know, they were trying to differentiate themselves from their adult versions. So I think they were just, being a bit louder, a bit more like not put together. So I felt that young Jane was kind of annoying, and I couldn't really stand the screaming of Adele. But yes, we did start with Jane's birth. And one thing that I loved about that scene of like baby Jane getting passed from dead mom to dead dad to dead uncle is the way that they use this kind of trap door in the stage to
Mm-hmm.
signify somebody dying. Of they would like then walk down into this trap door, and then that
Mm-hmm.
means that they've passed on. So I was anticipating that being used later in the production to give us kind of like to make us think that maybe Rochester was dead. Like I thought maybe they would open the door and have him be like halfway standing in and out, but they didn't do that, and I think they missed an opportunity there.
I literally, that would have upset me so much. I agree that I think my initial reaction to this adult woman, who's 38, by the way, so she is officially our oldest Jane.
Mm.
She was 38 at the time of recording this. I did have a moment of like, oh, you're gonna be a child, but I think because I think it establishes something that I think is really important in this play, which is a lot of the things are metaphoric. A lot
Yes.
of the characters are going to suddenly be a different character because they're wearing a bow on their head. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so much of like who this person is established by the costume that the single piece of costuming that they just put on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that having the space that our imaginations need to fill for this
Mm-hmm.
would mean that it would almost be jarring to have a child come in and switch to a child because it's like almost too real. And I think I personally really liked her portrayal of a child. I think her body movements and
Mm-hmm.
like the voice choices that she made, yeah, but like I think that the way she like moved her body was really interesting, and
Yeah.
the way she like curled in on herself or stood up in this very like, it just was a very like I don't want to say childish in like a good way, like
Yeah.
it was a childish way to portray some of those inner feelings, and I think she did a really good job with that. I did see how, like, I think my suspension of like reality for that happened quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see how it would have been annoying if you got stuck in this woman is almost 40 years old and
Mm-hmm.
she's stomping her feet.
Well, one thing that I did appreciate that they did this for both Jane and Adele is that
Mm-hmm.
so the way you described the set, right, is that there's kind of at one point this elevated platform, but
Mm-hmm.
there's this decent amount of space underneath it. And they had hung these kind of like metal bars
Mm-hmm.
underneath. So at one point when we see young Jane still at the Reed's house, she's like I think supposed to be up in the attic, and she's like swinging on the bars, kind of like their monkey bars. And then later on, when we're at Thornfield, we see Adele doing the same thing. And so that
Mm-hmm.
was a fun kind of being like, oh, this is like children just make play out of their environment. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was displayed very well. So that was cool.
I also, one of the lines, so there's so many lines in this that are like so close to things in the book, and then other things where I meant to check if this was in the book before we got here, but something that I've never noticed a broccoli say before. So Jane is at the Reeds. John beats her. She attacks him back. They do the red room, which we can talk about here in a second. But specifically, I wanted to talk about when Broccoli comes and he's wearing a choice top hat. He says the classic lines of like, where to, like, you're a liar, lying is bad, like but he gives her the book, which I know we've had him give her before, about
Mm-hmm.
children who lie and the bad things. And then he says a line I don't remember in other things, which is, I penned it myself.
I think that is in the novel. I think, yes, he wrote this book.
I was pretty sure it was in the book, but I've never seen a Broccoli with so much pride
Oh my
just be
gosh.
like, I did this. I wrote this book about children lying and how they're going to go to hell. And I'm like, what a great use of your limited human hours.
So good. Oh my god. No. Were there specific things about the red room that you like wanted to go into?
I just wanted to talk a bit about I think how the lighting in there brings me into the lighting in general, which I was fully obsessed with the lighting of this
Yes.
play. So they start with this like really harsh light that is really, really rigid
Mhm.
in both in the Reed's house and in it's less, there's less of it, but it's also there in Lowood. And the moments of like the red room and some of these other haunting moments, like it, the whole stage is so, because all of the stage is so neutral, the
Mhm.
lighting takes over the whole thing. So like the way
Yeah.
they played that with the trapdoor, with the lighting, with the way that Uncle Reed came back up from that trapdoor of death and was
Mhm.
there, and the way that they were able to make Jane feel so isolated
Yeah.
in with just the lighting.
Yeah, because there's a part in the book which we now know, of course, since we've read it, where
Big, big flex for us guys.
boom. No, but when she's in the red room, because it's like completely dark, she gets kind of spooked for a second when she catches her own reflection in the mirror. And the way that they did that with the lighting is that they kind of like cast almost as if light had hit the mirror and then that light was reflected down upon her. But yeah, no, they did so many clever things. I think one of my favorites, like with such a minimalistic stage, like when you go to Lowood, right? These
Mm-hmm.
kind of like girls' dresses, the uniforms come down from the
Mm-hmm.
ceiling and kind of hang there. I think is sort of a way to sort of imply there's like kind of a crowd or there's more
Mm-hmm.
people here. When she goes to Thornfield, those dresses rise and then down come these like bare
Mm-hmm.
Edison bulbs, which I think both sort of mimic the stars, but then also
Mm-hmm.
like the sconces that would have been inside of the home. And
Yeah.
so many things like that.
And the
So
light,
cool.
yeah, the light is so much warmer in Thornfield.
Yeah.
And like I said, like you go from this like harsh light in very rigid light
Hmm.
in some of these other, it's almost fluorescent. Like I don't know things about names of lighting, so I know I'm wrong, but send us emails. But into this very warm light, like you said, with those Edison bulbs, that's like it has this like magical feeling.
Yeah.
And her walking into Thornfield, you get some of that music, you get this light, and you have these actors holding up these lights and like essentially following them up these stairs, acting as sconces.
Yeah.
And it's incredible. And it feels, and you watch her be mesmerized by this place, and it immediately establishes Thornfield as something big and grand and mysterious and magical
Yeah.
in a way that feels welcoming. And then with slight switches to that music, there's music and colors of the lighting, there's these slight moments of like ominousness.
Yeah.
But it can flip us back to that warmth in a way that I
Hmm.
don't think a lot of adaptions capture Jane's love for Thornfield, because they're
Yeah.
so focused on establishing that Thornfield is creepy.
Right. No, all of those notes are so good. I also think when you mention how obviously can become ominous because we have this whole like subplot of
Mm-hmm.
what's going on with that laughter. Why did his bed start on fire? There's something creepy about Thornfield. I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was done so well. The way that they handled like Grace Poole is a character whose face we
Mm-hmm.
never see. She's often on like the back of the stage,
Mm-hmm.
kind of in shadow. And so I thought that added this whole layer of suspense.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may kind of dip into this a little early, so the woman who plays Bertha,
Mm-hmm.
she is out on the stage before Bertha is ever seen because she
Mm-hmm.
stands out there and she sings these very beautiful songs. And a lot
Mm-hmm.
of them felt to me like kind of like folk songs, like kind of old English folk songs that they had kind of like adapted. And so she's kind of always this presence there. And I was wondering
Mm-hmm.
about that, of being like, are we supposed to know that her voice being heard is also supposed to be like this like presence that is being felt? And I think that is definitely supposed to be part of the case.
Yeah.
Because yes, then later when that actress shows up as the character as Bertha, I thought that was really cool to be like, oh, she's always kind of been here, sort of like haunting and guiding us with her song.
It felt so similar to me to what we talked about in the radio adaptation, the 94 radio adaptation, where the voice of Bertha is haunting Jane and is different things at different points. But
Mm-hmm.
that idea of, I think it really leans into that idea of Bertha as more than a person. She's also a metaphor. And there's so many moments. I don't know if we want to just talk about Bertha for a minute here, because
Let's do it.
there are so many moments. I think they handled Bertha incredibly well, like
Yes.
arguably one of the best. And I think so. She comes out on stage. She is the only character as well who wears the same outfit the whole time. She's in the same
Mm-hmm.
costume the entire time. So almost immediately, anyone who's familiar with Jane Eyre sees this woman in a red dress. And somehow that has been established to me as that is Bertha. So I immediately was like, this haunting figure in a red dress. The more times she kind of like showed up in a way, this is one of those things that I could watch this 1,000 times. Like the odds that there's a lot, the vast majority of the adaptations we watched, I watched it and I'm done with it now. This I think I genuinely will watch again. Bertha was doing so many things. Like that
Yeah.
actress playing, like she came in such an intentional way, and every single beat of this play is with an incredible amount of intention.
Yes.
And then when there's a moment that I genuinely went back and rewatched,
Mm-hmm.
where it's the moment that Jane, after the wedding, they go to meet Bertha, and there's so much movement and things happening around that. And there's so many people on stage. And there's a couple of beats that's Jane and Bertha looking at each other with a level of recognition that I think is incredible.
Well, I was so blown away by at the end when Jane comes back to Thornfield. This is the only song that I could identify that was a modern song. And Bertha's actress is singing kind of like a slow, spooky cover of Crazy by, and I
Mm-hmm.
have it here. His name is Gnarls Barkley, or Gnarls Barkley, Charles Barkley? Gnarls Barkley. It's GN. Anyway, but the way that if you're not familiar with that song, I mean, just the first lyrics here are, I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place. Even your emotions have an echo in so much space. And it's kind of like, you might think I'm crazy,
Mm-hmm.
possibly. I think you're crazy too. But it was almost this diet. It was almost this, like, she's singing to Jane. Like there was this kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing of like, we've both been affected by this man. We've both like been racked by our feelings because of our time in this space. And I thought it was a really cool way to kind of, I don't know, shine a new light on Bertha in a way that an adaptation hasn't done before.
And I think I'm so excited. I actually want to dive into the idea of these lyrics being sung by Bertha. And I think even I want to talk about it more in depth even when we have a Bertha episode coming up here.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's moments, I think that idea of Bertha having control is something we've talked about before. Actually, it's something we talked about when we talked about chapter 27 and how much control Bertha ended up having over Rochester's life.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a song that I've known for a really, really long time. If you haven't listened to it, I think listening to it might feel really jarring to think about as a Jane Eyre thing, but reading it almost as poetry, and imagine that being Bertha's voice, as that idea of, does that make me crazy? And saying that over and over again, and then responding with possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a moment that the only lyric that I noticed that is different, and she sings this is Bertha's ghost singing this at this point. Who do you think you are? Ha ha ha. And the line in the song is bless your soul.
Mm-hmm.
But the line in the play is bless my soul.
Oh, nice. Spooky.
And then it's followed up by you really think you're in control.
Mm.
And the idea that she is singing that after her death, I think both at Rochester and Jane,
Yeah.
sort of saying like, it's haunting, her existence haunts their lives, and her suit, I think it's an argument on her suicide, right? Like it's a conversation about it, because I think we talk a lot about the idea of, is Bertha crazy or did this world make her take a woman who they couldn't control and imply that she's crazy? And
Yeah.
that's a grand question about Jane Eyre. And I do
Yeah.
not think that Charlotte Bronte has a solid answer, and we will talk about that.
Oh, totally.
But I think this play is leaning hard into that question. And there's so many moments where Bertha's presence is felt in a way that I love.
One of the things that's standing out to me, first of all, I got goosebumps when we were talking about this. Second of all, this question that you're asking, like, is she actually crazy, or like, did it do this to her? I think one of the things that makes that question so prominent in this production is the fact that we never see this Bertha rage or act like out of her like mind in any way. She's very stoic. She walks with grace and purpose. Every action when setting his bed on fire is very intentional. There's no doubt or anything, and it's just like this guy put me up in this house and now he's flirting with somebody, so logically I must set his bed on fire.
Even attacking Mason. We see her attack Mason and she seems totally sane, and then we see her kind of launch forward, but the actual attack is hidden, and when she steps back she seems very calm and measured as well, which is like in so many ways even crazier.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Oh, okay, the other thing that they did with Bertha and Jane that I was obsessed with is, so earlier in the show we got a couple scenes of this where, to imply either that time is passing or significant change is happening, Jane will change costumes, and it's usually done by having the ensemble help her. So when she goes from child to teacher, they bring out a corset for her, they help her step into her governess dress. We see a similar thing happen when she's preparing for her wedding. Two dresses come down, there's the governess dress and now her wedding dress, which she gets into. What I loved most is after the wedding and the explanation and everything, we see Jane take off her wedding dress and she's standing there in kind of her underclothes, and then Bertha walks up to her and hands her back the governess dress. And for me, what that kind of symbolized is that I think there Bertha is sort of acting as like a living metaphor for the truth. And before, maybe Jane was in sort of like this fantasy, or maybe not by her choice, of course, but kind of this illusion that she could be Miss Rochester. And now that she knows that Bertha exists, the real Miss Rochester hands her back the uniform of the role that she must take on again, of being like, sorry, nope, this position has been filled. Go back to being a governess. That's all you'll be in this house until I'm gone. And I thought that was so fucking cool. I loved it so much.
And I think the emotions that those actresses had in that moment of Bertha handing her the dress was so demonstrated the complexity of what these two women have. And I think there's so much of Jane Eyre is these two women, and they never talk to each other and they never directly interact, and yet their lives are surrounding each other and they're so directly affected. And these beats of interaction that they have, because the only interaction that we have directly between Jane and Bertha in the book and in the vast majority of adaptations is the moment with the veil, which we do have in this. But that beat that they have when they first see each other, where they're looking at each other, and then the beat where Bertha is handing the dress to her, Bertha is certain, but she's not gloating, and she's not like possessive, and she's almost apologetic. Not quite, but close.
Yeah.
And Jane is almost apologetic also, and she's very resigned. And Jane does not blame Bertha for this. And there's there's other beats too. I think the next piece that I love about Bertha, but like in that moment, she's so resigned. The other beat that I loved what they did with Bertha is the way Bertha is circling Rochester and Jane while they're having the stay speech.
Yes.
It's incredible. Bertha is singing. Rochester is giving his speech, and what I think we're going to talk about Rochester, but I think an incredibly sympathetic Rochester in this moment. He is on the ground. Jane and Rochester are sitting on the ground. He is devastated, and he seems younger than any Rochester has ever seemed to me, even though he's
Hmm.
not young.
Mm-hmm.
But he's like almost curled up on the floor next to Jane, trying to explain what it was like to be a young man. Well, Bertha stands over him,
Mm-hmm.
looks down at him, and sings about the fact that, like, about those. I don't have the lyrics of that song, but like
Mm-hmm.
she's singing at him almost like they're in a duet where he's sharing his story. Bertha only ever sings in this production. She does not speak any words, but she
Mm-hmm.
sings.
Yeah.
And there's a moment when Rochester says something pretty awful about Bertha. And Jane comes back and says, "How could you say that about your wife?" Which I do believe is in the book.
Yeah, he says something about her, and she's like, how can you hate her so? Like, she can't help being mad. And he's like, I don't hate
Mm-hmm.
her because she's mad. And then he goes into, yeah, the details of how kind of cruel she was during their
Yeah.
marriage.
But it's this moment, I think those are the moments of interaction that we have between Jane and Bertha that I think Jane sympathizes. I genuinely believe that Jane sympathizes with Bertha in general, but I
Hmm.
also think this leans into that more than I've seen in adaptions. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
The vulnerability of them like sitting on the floor, I agree with that. I thought that was great. We've seen something similar in our other most recent adaptation, which is the autobiography in
Mm-hmm.
the web series version. That too, they're sitting on the floor of her bedroom having this
Mm-hmm.
conversation. So it's cool to see that that is something that kind of body language I think speaks to our modern audience and
Mm.
maybe always has, but like it's not something that we've always seen like displayed that way until in recent adaptations. So it's curious.
Well, and I think there's something about so often Rochester is in motion while Jane is sitting during this. And
Hmm.
there's something about him breaking down on the floor that leans harder into that vulnerability that we talk about is so critical to this scene,
Yeah.
that Rochester has to be vulnerable, that this is him putting his whole heart out there, that I
Hmm.
think is incredibly done.
So another thing that I want to talk about that you touched on with the fact of as the scene is happening and Bertha is literally looming over them, this is something that is used in like just theater direction in general, but stages and sets that utilize levels to
Mm-hmm.
convey like power dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
I first came across this in watching the behind the scenes of an absolutely unbelievable film called Far From Heaven. Very sad. So if you're not into sad stories, maybe don't watch it, but it's beautiful. But they had done this movie set similar to a stage set where they're like, when
Mm-hmm.
we're showing a power imbalance, the person who has the power will always be one level above the other individual. So that, and it's kind of ways of conveying, okay, is this person just physically like standing
Mm-hmm.
up there, or are they the one with the power, the control in the situation, looking down on others? So it's a very cool visual storytelling technique. And I
Mm-hmm.
saw that immediately in this like stage. And I was like, ooh, they're going to do cool things with that. And they did.
Yeah. They did that. They did that so well with so many other moments, cuz too, like, Jane is during the fire scene, the bed fire scene, whatever. You see Rochester like go off, and up in the back he's talking to Grace Poole about the fire and like so many other things. I want to talk. I want to talk a little bit about some of the transitional scenes and scoot back to some of the things in her childhood,
Mhm.
and then I think talk about Rochester for ever per always. But there was a couple of things within, particularly there's two scenes that mirror each other. One in her childhood and one shortly after she gets to Thornfield, that I thought was incredible. So throughout her childhood, when she's supposed to be a child, we see her learning all of these lessons.
Mhm.
And then when she becomes a teacher, like you talked about, there's that transitional scene where she puts on that other outfit. And there's they captured in this something that we talked about when we read the book we had not seen done that well, which is the repetitive, almost trapped way that she is living at Lowood
Yeah.
and her desire for literally anything different.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually have the quotes written down both from the book and from the play. So give me just a second. I think it's not the first time, but it's fairly early on. So it's still one of the first times where we see her have a conversation with those internal people. It's not quite as blatant as it is in some of the other scenes,
Mm-hmm.
but we're watching her as some of the ensemble cast play her students who are answering questions that Jane answered as a child. Like it's the same questions. She's teaching them the same ways to sew, all these other things. And you can see as it kind of like spins around her, that movement shows the move forward of time.
Mm-hmm.
And they keep holding up window frames.
Yes.
And she keeps looking out the window with this desire for more. And she says, I'll read the lines in the play first, but it's, I must have liberty. And if I cannot have liberty, then I must have change. Grant me at least a new servitude.
Mm-hmm.
The line from the book is, I desire liberty. For liberty I grasp. For liberty I utter a prayer. It seems scattered to the wind, faintly blowing. I abandoned it and framed it as a humbler supplicant for change simultaneous. That petition too seemed swept off to a vague place. Then I said to myself, desperate, grant me at least a new servitude. So this idea that that in the book, it talks about how she's reframing liberty into change, into a new servitude.
Mm-hmm.
And in the play, she literally says liberty while looking through a frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then switches it to change and then switches it to servitude while frames are moving around her.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why I think I could watch this play 1,000 times, because I bet there's so many more things like that,
Yeah.
that if we took the passage and put it up against the play, we would see even more of this like depth that the director and writers have put into this.
Yes.
Which it's Sally Cookston, by the way,
Nice.
is the director.
No, clearly a avid reader and someone who understands the source material. Because yes, that was beautifully done. I loved the frames and the windows. I think one of my favorite moments in the entire production, though, is when they kind of brought that effect back. And I think it's supposed to be when she's wandering on top of the roof of Thornfield, and these the ensemble cast return and they bring back the frames and they create sort of this double French door window almost thing. And Jane pushes the windows open, and then it's like this insane wind that blows behind her and all the other stage goes dark, and it's like she's just completely practically beaten down by the force of this wind. And it's kind of this, I think it's like that's what's out there, that's the power of what lies beyond these walls. And it's then after that she starts to hear the laughter and everything else, but that effect was done so cool.
Totally. And I think they're absolutely supposed to be reminiscent of one another, because the frames, despite the fact that they're these moving frames that are being held by ensemble cast members, they're moving around her, but they feel like they're trapping her in. She feels she's surrounded by people, and then she's surrounded by this additional layer of these frames coming around that feel like she's been trapped in this place. And she does such a great job of making us also feel that with her body movements and the tone of voice and all these other things, as she's desperate to get out of that. And so to then use that visual again in this moment where it creates this instant sense of the freedom and I think that is, it's so well done, because it's something that I didn't quite you get illusions of it and some of the other things, but it's so important in the book. The difference between being a teacher at Lowood and going off and becoming a governess to Jane, what that means for Jane and who she is as a person is so important.
Yeah.
And I think they captured that in a way that I just have not seen in any other adaptation.
I loved it. The other cool, like, spooky effect that they did that was kind of similar to that is when Jane has this kind of dream, and then also it sort of
Mhm.
mixes with her waking up and finding the veil ripped. But so the way they do it is that Jane begins at the bottom of this ladder, and she has this big veil trained behind her, and she's climbing the ladder, and someone is holding the end of it, and then two other cast members come under with these big fans, so it's billowing out behind her. And if
Mhm.
anyone here, probably many of you, have seen the movie Singing in the Rain, it made me think of that kind of dream dance sequence they have where she's got that 2 mile long silk scarf that's like flying behind her. And so they kind of recreated that in this setting, and it was very spooky and very cool. And again, I'm just blown away by the creativity of it all, so that was awesome.
Well, and I think they did like that's I think what I meant when I at the very beginning of talking about they utilized this other format, adapting it into a play to really lean on some of these differences to tell the same story. I think a similar moment. So we go from Jane being really trapped at Lowood and having this repetitive nature and the fact that there's no change, there's nothing different is part of what is trapping her there, and making her need the difference and something else. She just feels this desire for something else. And then she goes to Thornfield and she immediately feels that. And we get this house that is completely alive and has this magical quality to it. And she bursts open these windows and all this stuff. And then they go into her teaching Adele. And they do the same thing where it starts as this new interesting thing. And then they have this scene where Adele and Mrs. Fairfax and Jane are rotating around each other, doing the same thing all the time. And Adele is getting frustrated with it. And Jane, you can also tell, is getting Mrs. Fairfax is totally fine with it.
She's like,
But
oh, that girl.
You can tell Jane, it's so reminiscent of this other moment where she felt trapped,
Mhm.
that you feel that same thing for her again, and she needs something different. And what do we get? A Mr. Rochester.
A Mr. Rochester, which I feel like, so for the most part so far, you and I have been on the exact same page. From what you said earlier, I feel like we're about to divert paths. So when I obviously caught on right away that this is the one small cast where they will all be playing different characters, and I looked at every man in the cast, and I was like, none of these guys are doing it for me. And then lo, out comes the balding, bearded guy, and I'm like, oof, this is the first Rochester I've seen who truly is unattractive. Like, I was like, oh man, okay, but authentic.
I mean this, I have seen pictures of both of these humans. They are not unattractive human beings. I think they did a good job of making the characters look unattractive. I think the person I was most surprised by was the actress who played Jane, because I was like, I can't say she's ugly. That's so mean to say on a podcast. And then I went and Googled her and looked at pictures of her. It's like, oh, she's gorgeous. They just did a good job of like making her hair messy and like,
and she just looks like she's constantly crying. So
she looks sort of plain. Like I think she's incredible. And so I thought his portrayal of Rochester I sort of loved.
I thought he was a good actor. I didn't like he was doing the mean shouty version of Rochester that I'm not a fan of. I didn't see 1 ounce of sweetness or tenderness until the very end when he's blind. Like, I hated the proposal scene.
Oh my god. You hated the proposal
he
scene?
Literally screamed at her the whole time, and she was screaming back, so it's like they're on the same ground, but I'm like, this isn't romantic for me. Like, he was just full on shouting at her. Like, it was kind of worse, almost. I think it was almost worse than Syrian Hines' proposal.
No.
No, he's like, Jane, marry me, Jane, say yes. Okay, you're married. And I'm like, there's no romance here. I'm like, stop it.
First of all, they were so much better at kissing.
Yes, they're much better at kissing.
Okay, here's my defense of him. I think you're wrong.
We can both agree to disagree, but this Rochester did not do it for me.
Here's my points, and I literally wrote some of these down. So I personally think that we've talked so much about Syrian Hines' performance. It's so funny to me how much we've talked about this person whose performance we dislike. But I think particularly we talked about this a lot in the 94 version with the radio adaptation and the fact that he does not understand Rochester.
Mhm.
I think that what Syrian Hines was trying to do, and if he had understood the character of Rochester, I think as an actor, he's capable of doing,
Yeah.
is what this actor did.
Mhm.
Which we've talked about how many of the moments of Rochester, it's just him talking and we don't know what he's doing with his body. We don't know what his tone is. We don't know all these other things. And I think this is on the scale of how harsh Rochester can be. This is certainly on the far side of harsh. But I think he has moments of vulnerability that I see build as he trusts and cares about Jane more. And I think I personally loved it. I think there's a particular moment. I actually highlighted this in my notes because I wanted to make sure to mention it. So one beat that I think this is probably the only change I would make is they have Jane meet Rochester on her way to Thornfield, and then he's not there and doesn't show up for weeks, which was just kind of like weird. I think they needed it. They did a full hour of her like childhood into Lowood, so she didn't get to Thornfield until an hour, and so I think it could have been a moment of like, you gotta have Rochester in the first hour and a half of Jane.
Yes, otherwise everyone's like, why are we here?
I think so. They, in that moment when they meet, I think they catch the things about that I so often find in your yelly Rochesters are missed, which is he's mad about the fact that he fell off his horse.
Yeah.
Like that's what he's mad about.
He did say fuck several times, which was funny. He
just swears, which is hilarious. And he's on the ground and Pilot's being annoying. And then this random woman who he does not know comes and bothers him and he tells her to go away because but it feels like he's yelling it because he's in pain and annoyed and like there's a look on his face when he realizes she's still there because he stays on his back. So he probably assumed she left. And she says, I can't think of leaving you like this. And he takes a beat and goes and looks at her and accepts her help after that. And he's still frustrated, but he gets like a lot less dramatic about it. And that's the first moment of softening. And I think there's a million other moments like that I see this Rochester have. I see him do it in their conversation by the fire when he's like, hey Jane, tell me things about you. I like that we get to see them watch each other.
Yeah.
So with that rotating stage again, we see him watching her teaching Adele. We see him watching her walking around the garden.
Which is something that we'd mentioned from one of our recent book reviews, is that he tells her that. He's like, there was a while when I just studied you. And I found that a little creepy to admit. But
it was a little creepy to admit. It was a little creepy to watch. But then we got to watch her. They catch each other in moments when they don't think they're being observed. And the Rochester one was so well done that in the moment I was so in it. But when you describe it on a podcast sounds super weird, which is he's outside petting Pilot and scratching his tummy. Pilot is played by a grown-ass man.
Yes, which I loved, that apart from just this man doing an amazing impression of a dog, they also, like, when he was playing Pilot, he would hold like this little cord in his hand, which he would like swing to be his dog tail, and I was like, okay, that's cute.
It was so cute. And I thought that the way that Rochester interacted with Pilot was so lovely, but I think he was harsh, but I liked the way it was like it felt so much more justifiable that he was just an incredibly emotional man. And I think his vulnerabilities were really out there. What did you think of his stay speech?
I thought it was good. What I was missing that I like in other stay speeches is that, like, I just personally did not see like a spark or chemistry between these two. And I'm sorry, I never saw him be like kind to her. I felt like he just was harsh the whole time. And especially when he's like playing the jealousy game. I was like, how I was thinking to myself, I'm like, if this was my first time seeing Jane Eyre, I'd be like, girl, what do you see in this guy? I would be struggling with that. And so I thought he did his stay speech very well. But I think because I wasn't previously invested in their love, like these two in particular, it didn't like blow me away by any means.
I was so
I liked
invested
that
in their
they
love.
I like that they called out the fact that, you know, he's like, I got to a point at one point where I like almost like offed myself. Like I was so miserable. And then the winds of England called me home and blah, blah, blah. So I thought all of that was good. I personally didn't like his like kissing, being like, will you stay now? Smooch. How about now? Because he seemed very violent with that. Also, he was very it seemed dangerous to me, like way too dangerous when he's grabbing her and doing the line of like, I can bend you between my thumb and forefinger. He full on like was palming her hand and he was like squeezing her jaw, and I'm like, this is too aggressive for me. I think you need to be a little softer. Like you can say that line without physically grabbing her and making her afraid. So he was too much. He's not my Rochester.
Here's my two things. One thing that you have accused me of before is I think you're judging him a little extra harshly because you don't think he's a hot hottie.
Well, you know, sometimes it's a big thing for me, but also, Lillian, you will know from experience that I am very easy to fall in love with the world's ugliest people. And I'm not talking about my fiance. I'm talking about all the 40 and 50-year-old mashed potato men that I had crushes on when I was 12. So, okay, I am all right with loving not attractive people.
Well, and we both love, and I mean this with all the love in the world, we both love George C. Scott.
Yeah. I actually think he's kind of handsome. So
anyway, I think that you not finding this man attractive and his scraggly beard that he has the whole time, I think you don't enjoy. So I think that's part of the reason why you don't like a great Rochester.
Maybe, but also I just thought he was angry and gruff and violent and distant.
Well, and I think I personally love I could bend you between my fingers line given whilst holding her. I think the 2011 also does that incredibly well in a way that like feels dangerous but a little sexy. But I think I'm going to argue format on that one in particular as to why, because we have talked about the idea that there's a really thin line that all of these adaptions dance on, and some of them go way too far. Syrian Hines is an example of like way too far over. Even moments George C. Scott dances on that line in a way that makes me uncomfy when he breaks that vase at dinner. But I personally think if you're sitting in the back of this theater, you still want to be able to see him being intense with her.
Oh, totally. And that's, I think, a very fair point is yes, like if you are in like farther away in a dark room and maybe it's harder to see, then maybe it doesn't look quite that violent. When it's a high quality, like filmed version of this and you're right up there as he's like squishing her face, I'm like, ooh, yeah, get out of there, Jane. This is not good.
I don't know. I thought it was good. I really believed them. I personally think they have fantastic chemistry. I loved the proposal scene. I loved the way that they were circling around each other. I loved the way, because it always feels to me, in the book, it really felt this way to me. And I think in this adaptation, my favorite adaptation, it feels to me a little bit like he's sort of gone, I've lost my mind, Jane. I'm going to marry, if you don't stop me, I'm going to marry Blanche for real. I'm going to kiss her and stuff. She's going to live in the house where I live and we're going to kiss
stuff.
Unless somebody says something right now that's like, don't do it. Like if there was somebody else who had feelings, but like, I thought she did I thought her speech of like frustration was so good. We've got an 83 episode coming up, and I think you're going to be mad about my feelings about the 83 proposal scene, which is I hate it.
Well, so, okay, here's one thing that I want to bring up, because first of all, I value your opinion, and I hope that you value mine.
I also value yours.
Thank you. One thing that I think is so curious to hear you say that is because one thing that stood out for me from our conversations, from especially with like these recent book episodes, is talking about how do you portray feminism without it simply
Mm,
being hands on the hips and shouting. And that's one thing that stood out to me personally in this scene, the proposal scene, is how much it felt like a screaming match to me between him and her. Like she screamed most of those lines. And when I say screamed, I mean like she was just like very loud and on the verge of tears and like, you know, putting back as much emotion as he was putting towards her. And I have to say, honestly, and this is just my opinion, I kind of prefer the proposals where we get sort of that gentle strength of Jane's feminism, in where she doesn't need to scream at him. She can simply stand there and speak her truth, and that's what moves him. So I think that's one thing. I'm just kind of curious to know what your thoughts are of
yeah.
that.
I think the quiet feminism for me plays out in different moments. Like I
Mm-hmm.
think it plays out in the stay speech moment for me. And I think you see that in this. And I think it plays out in her arguments with Sinjin, which I think we see that in this. I think that the proposal scene, the reason I like it screamier or just like higher emotions is I think that Jane and Rochester are more themselves and are a little bit more raw
Mm-hmm.
when they're together. And I like the proposal scene at this heightened emotion, particularly this one. Again, I think it would look wild in a movie the way they
Mm-hmm.
did it. But again, I'm giving them a little extra room because it's a play.
Yeah.
But I think what I like about this scene doing it that way and them being really emotional is in so many ways, women are often taught to not be emotional. Like it's about controlling their emotions. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Jane is doing that all the way through while Rochester is desperately trying to get her to be really emotional.
Yeah.
And what I like about it is it feels like a manifestation of her argument that women have just as big of an internal life as
Mm-hmm.
men do. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's bringing to the surface all of these feelings that she's been feeling. And up until that point, Rochester has been going, I think she feels passionately about me, but I can't see it. So therefore, it's not real. So I need to push her into a situation where he can see it. And I love a turn in a proposal scene. And
Mm-hmm.
I think this had a really, really good turn where it went like he gets what he wants and realizes he's gone too far. Because
Mm-hmm.
Rochester goes too far.
Yes, he
There's
does.
like the character of Rochester goes too far in pushing
Mm-hmm.
Jane. And that's why she breaks that hard. And I think at that moment where he tries to gather her up and she pushes away and says the classic, he's like, whoa, you're so frantic like a bird. Like, chill out, babe. And she's like, I am no bird, no net ensnares me. I think she did that incredibly. And the way she walks away from him and the fact that in that desperation to get her to even hear him back, he just yells, marry me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think the way that then transitions into their
Mm-hmm.
calmer, more vulnerable conversation
Mm-hmm.
after this like really high emotion conversation where they both are really demonstrating the passionate way that they're loud,
Mm-hmm.
I like. And then
Mm-hmm.
the quiet way they come together, I love.
I will say, so all of those points that you made, very valid. I think, yes, even though this wasn't the proposal scene for me, it
Mm-hmm.
was still an amazing like performance and was
Mm-hmm.
well done. But I'm thinking now again about how well they used the levels of the stage during that proposal, because
Yeah.
it begins with them on the same level, which I actually think he should have been higher up than her, because again, he's doing this manipulation. But you know, as this kind of fallout starts to
Mm-hmm.
happen, ends up down on the ramp and she's up on the higher level, because then, like you say, now he has gone too far. She has all the power to say yes or no, and he's like, oh shit, like she's getting away. I need to do something. And then when they kind of come together to do their kiss is when he like climbs the ladder, and then they're kind of
Mm-hmm.
parallel with one another. And I am I remembering right that they do this move where after they kiss the first time, they then kind of rotate around who is on the outside of the ladder and who is standing on the platform.
They
They switch
definitely are doing
positions.
like a rotate. They throughout this whole thing,
Hmm.
they are like what's it called when the planets they're
Orbiting,
orbiting
yes,
each
they're
other.
orbiting one
They're
another, yes.
And I think that's part of like the beauty of the scene of the stage in general, is that like all of this story feels very in motion, and I think it's so incredible.
Mm-hmm.
But they orbit around each other further apart as they fall in love, and then that gets tighter and tighter and tighter until they're still orbiting around each other during this proposal.
Yeah.
I
So
love
that was
it.
all awesome and I loved it. I personally had a big kick out of the kind of like getting ready for the wedding montage that happened where at one point, you know, he's doing his thing where he's like, "I bought you like miles of silk." And she's like, "I'm not going to use that so you can make 10,000 waistcoats for yourself."
Yeah.
And she's just like all of her stuff. And he's like, "You can't get married in old boots." Like that's literally a line that he says to her. And she's like,
And
"I'm going to get married in old boots. So deal with it."
they're so smiley and cute at each other. I can't believe you don't love them.
I'm sorry. He wasn't the one for me. But that's okay. uh
I do think, just a note on, sorry, I was looking back at my notes about the wedding scene and I noticed that I had a couple of other of the lines from some of the songs. I do think some of these other songs are modern songs. I did try to find a soundtrack for this and
I would
could
love that.
not.
That
So if
sucks.
someone could please find me a soundtrack for this, that would be spectacular. Thank you.
The next best thing, I need to look up the actress who plays Bertha and see if she has like an account on like Spotify or something. Like I want to listen to this woman sing constantly. She's so talented.
She's incredible. I think all in all, there's so many other like really nitpicky like little things that we could talk about, like the way they do travel in this. I think it makes it so much more of an adventure than any of the, like when she goes off to Lowood, when she goes up, like it feels like an adventure in a way that it feels like an annoying slog everywhere else.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But no, I think we should wrap up because we've already
Let's
touched
just
on
talk
like all
about it forever.
the major amazing things. Lillian, are you ready with your rating?
I am.
Mm-hmm.
It has not changed. I haven't done a perfect 10 for a Jane Eyre. I've done 2 at 10s.
Mm-hmm.
I gave the 2011 a 10, and I can't remember what the other one that I gave a 10 was. Or not a 10, 9s.
I was going to say, that sounds like a perfect 10 to me, Lillian.
Here's the thing. Numbers are hard. And sometimes you record a podcast after you didn't sleep that much and you've been hanging out with your friend for a couple hours.
You know, it happens.
But I haven't they've given 2 9s. So 1 9 was to the 2011, and I can't remember what the other 9 was. I've given more than that to some of our palette cleansers. I debated giving this a 10. I think there's minor imperfections, but I'm giving it a 9.5. This is I personally think this is the best adaptation we've watched so far.
Very cool. And what is your mode of ranking?
Sorry, I almost wanted to say this very specific Rochester just to be like, because you're wrong. I think I'm gonna do it. Oh, good God. I'm gonna do Red Dresses.
Okay, cool. Awesome. And I'm going to give mine a 9 out of 10 Edison bulbs. Yes. I was absolutely inspired and I just was so happy by how clearly the people who made this cares about the story and how much thought they put into it. I am obsessed with the imagination and the creativity of it. It felt very whimsical. It made me feel like I need to go see some local theater soon.
Mm-hmm.
Like I need to get out and like go to the Minnesota Orchestra. Like I just want culture now because this felt so cultured and I loved it.
It was another adaptation that I'm trying to get my little paws on, that I think feels similarly like art in the clips that I've seen, is there's a ballet performance of Jane Eyre that I've seen a couple of clips of. And I have emails the ballet that put it on, and I was like, hey, I've noticed some clips. Did you guys record a whole thing, and can I have it?
Amazing.
But I think this adaptation reminded me of the fun of the podcast. Like, we have a hoot when we watch a bad TV movie. Like that is a fun time. This is like the joy of this podcast is getting to like be like, look at how different and incredible this is.
Yeah, no, 100%. Oh my gosh. If you have not seen this version, there are sneaky ways of watching it on Vimeo. Otherwise, you can do some kind of subscription with the people who actually support it, which would be great because they deserve your
National
money.
Theater Live has a streaming service, and you get access to all sorts of other things. There's another, Sally Cookston, the director, who I believe also was involved in the creation of the script and things. She also has a version of Peter Pan that has some of the same actors.
Oh my God. Okay, well, I need to watch that next because I'm obsessed with Peter Pan. So, wow, I'd love to see what she does with that story. But yeah, so many ways to watch it. Definitely go check this out if you haven't seen it yet and you're a Jane Eyre fan. If you have seen it and you have your own amazing thoughts, or if you are someone from the theater background and can tell us all of the cool things that we missed or explain some of these lighting concepts and other things, tell us your thoughts, reach out to us. You can find us at Airbuds on all the major social, and we would love to get an email from you if you have other things to share. Airbuds@gmail.com.
And if you are a theater person who is looking for more theater related podcast content, I've got some great news for you. So, my other podcast, which I only mention every single episode of this, I'm sorry, it's deeply relevant this week, is I just did last week an episode on anti-racism in theater, and I talked to a woman who works in community theater, and she was incredible and had some really cool things to say. So if you're looking for more theater related podcast content, that's a great place to go. Head over to the Care So Much feed for that. If you are sitting in your little on the edge of your little seat going, but guys, what are you talking about next week? Guess what? Next week's a special episode. We do mini episodes around the holidays. And we are going to be talking about, with all the love in the world, a defense of Michael Jaston, where I am going to be putting together a defense of why Michael Jaston is not, in fact, one of the worst Rochesters. He's one of the best, and get P. Clevey over on our side.
I'm very excited for this. I want you all to envision that I will be like strapped into a chair with the kind of clockwork orange like gadgets on my eyelids so I can't look away. And Lillian will be like, welcome to my forced TED Talk. By the end of this, you will agree with me. Otherwise, you don't get to go home. So we will see what happens.
And if you have reasons, your favorite Michael Jaston moments, please let me know about them so I can include them in my defense of him. I have already gotten an incredibly detailed response from Charlene of show favorite. I did reach out to her specifically.
She's his number one fan and his real life best friend.
Yeah, so. They're real life best friends, guys. I thought that was a joke. It's very, very real. But no, I sent her a message a couple weeks ago. I was like, hey, I'm doing something I feel underqualified for. Can you help me?
Let me just like open my fan album that I've created and take a peek into my shrine.
She very clearly put a lot of thought into it, and it's so appreciated and wonderful. So she's the secret third host of next week's episode.
Amazing. Can't wait. So please, guys, tune in next time. Join us for that. We'll see if my opinion is changed. I, for the record, don't hate him. I just am not crazy about him. So maybe I will be donning a I Love Michael Jaston t-shirt at the end of that episode, but you'll only know if you tune in. So yes. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for engaging with us. We love you so much. Until next week, happy Jane Eyre reading and watching. Bye, guys.
Bye.